The house, from the outside, was a postcard of a suburban American dream in San Diego, California. The garden, with its meticulously pruned roses and vibrant green grass, looked like something out of a home decor magazine. The paint, in an impeccable shade of beige, reflected the afternoon sun, projecting an image of stability, of a happy and successful family. It was a perfect facade, built with the sweat of a lifetime of work, mine and my late husband's, but which now only served to hide the rot growing inside, a veil that concealed a reality of isolation and cruelty. Inside, the lie became even more evident. The common areas, where my son Marcos received his guests, were a showroom of modernity. An Italian leather sofa, a flat-screen television that took up almost the entire wall, and abstract art objects that I didn't understand. But one only had to go upstairs to find a completely different world. The silence, which in the downstairs rooms felt like peace, up here transformed into a physical presence, heavy and oppressive. It was a silence filled with unspoken words, with fear, and with a loneliness that chilled the bones. I moved through this house like a ghost, a shadow in my own home. At 74, my frail body seemed to have absorbed the weight of daily humiliation. My shoulders, once straight and proud from a life dedicated to caring for others as a nurse, were now stooped, surrendered. I walked barefoot on the worn carpet of the hallway, trying not to make a sound, trying to become invisible so as not to bother the owner of the house, who was ironically my son, living under the roof that I had earned. My eyes, which had once been a mirror of compassion and care, were now just two deep, frightened hollows in a pale face. The wrinkles, which should have told stories of smiles and a life well lived, were now furrows of sadness and helplessness. Hunger was a constant companion, an emptiness in my stomach that mirrored the emptiness in my soul. It had been 2 days since I had eaten a real meal, and the weakness was beginning to cloud my thoughts, leaving only the primary instinct for survival. That night, the sound of Marcos's key in the front door was like an alarm. His firm, heavy footsteps on the polished wood floor announced his arrival. He was not alone. He brought with him the warm, greasy aroma of food, a smell that invaded the house and clung to my nostrils, torturing my empty stomach. It was a passive cruelty, a constant reminder of everything I was denied. My body trembled, not just from weakness, but from a desperate craving. I gathered what little strength I had left and went downstairs, each step a monumental effort. My heart beat erratically against my ribs, a drum of fear and need. Marcos was in the kitchen, unwrapping a juicy roasted chicken and golden potatoes. He wore a designer shirt, his expensive watch shining under the light. He was the image of success, a success built on my misery, on the retirement money he controlled with an iron fist. I stood at the kitchen entrance, feeling small and insignificant. Shame burned my face, but the hunger was stronger. My voice came out as a hoarse whisper, broken by lack of use and the dryness in my throat. "Marcos," I began, and his eyes rose to meet mine, cold and impatient. "Please, I'm hungry. Just a piece, a plate of food." The plea was there, naked and pathetic, for him to see. He looked at me for a long moment, a silence that stretched for an eternity. There was no compassion in his gaze, only irritated boredom. Without a word, he sat down at the table, cut a generous piece of chicken, and brought it to his mouth, chewing slowly, his eyes fixed on mine. He ate. He ate a hearty meal, plate after plate, while I watched, paralyzed by pain and disbelief. Every forkful was a stab to my spirit. When he finished, he wiped his mouth with a paper napkin, the gesture calm and deliberate. He stood up and walked over to me. The smell of food emanated from him, a scent that made me dizzy. He looked me up and down, a thin, cruel smile on his lips. "You will only eat when you learn not to bother me," he said, his voice low and full of contempt. The sentence hung in the air, sharp as a shard of glass. He grabbed my arm, the strength in his fingers surprising. It didn't hurt physically, but the humiliation was profound. He led me upstairs, as if I were a disobedient child being taken for punishment. He opened the door to my room, a small, poorly furnished space that looked more like a cell, and pushed me inside. I didn't resist, my body limp and my mind numb with shock. The sound of the key turning in the lock from the outside was the crack the universe needed to break apart. The metallic click echoed in the silence of the dark room, a definitive, final sound. It was not just a door being locked, it was my life being sealed, my dignity being buried. In that moment, locked in the darkness, with my stomach rumbling and my heart in pieces, the pain of hunger transformed into something different. An overwhelming clarity, cold and sharp, took hold of me. This was not carelessness, not an overwhelmed son losing his patience. This was abuse. This was evil in its purest form. My son did not love me. He did not care if I lived or died. He was, in fact, killing me slowly, locking me not just in the room, but in a prison of fear and hunger. I fell to the floor, the tears I had held back for so long finally rolling down my face. They were tears of despair, of pain, but also of a nascent anger. The sound of the key in the lock was not the end. He didn't know it, but that metallic click had not imprisoned me. On the contrary, that sound was the noise of my cage breaking. It was the sound of my freedom beginning to be born. The darkness of the room was no longer frightening. It became a cocoon, a place for my pain to transform into strength. There, on the cold floor, I understood that submission was no longer an option. Fighting was not a choice. It was the only way out. The frail, frightened woman who had begged for food downstairs had begun to die, and in her place, something new, strong, and unshakable was about to awaken. The initial crying, a spasm of pain and humiliation, slowly subsided. What remained was an icy clarity, a lucidity born of hunger and desperation. The wooden floor was cold against my skin, a cold that seemed to creep up my bones, but it was no longer a cold of fear. It was the cold of resolve. Each breath in the dark room was no longer a sigh of defeat, but an intake of oxygen for the flame of fury that had just ignited within me. My eyes, now accustomed to the gloom, scanned the small space that served as my prison, and then I saw it. In the farthest corner, almost swallowed by the shadows, was a small, dark wooden chest. It was an old object, a wedding gift from my father, which had survived all the moves and all the phases of my life. Marcos considered it old and useless junk, which was probably why he had never bothered to get rid of it. To him, it was trash. To me, it was an ark of treasures. With an effort that felt Herculean, I dragged my weakened body across the floor. My knees protested on the hard surface, and my arms trembled from lack of sustenance, but I moved toward the chest with a determination I hadn't felt in years. Every inch gained was a small victory against the apathy that had dominated me. The chest was not just an object. It was a destination, a forgotten sanctuary in the midst of my captivity. My trembling hands finally touched the worn, familiar wood. The lid creaked as it opened, releasing a scent that instantly transported me to another time. The aroma of cedar, old paper, and dried lavender. It was the smell of my past, the smell of love, the smell of a life I thought I had lost forever. I closed my eyes for a moment, inhaling that fragrance as if it were the purest of foods, nourishing my hungry soul, carefully, as if handling sacred relics. My fingers found a bundle of letters tied with a faded satin ribbon. They were letters from my Ricardo, my late husband. His elegant, slanted handwriting filled each envelope. They were letters from our courtship, from his time in the army, and even notes he would leave for me in the kitchen before he left for work. Each envelope was a promise of eternal love. Underneath the letters, I found what my heart had been searching for without knowing it. A photograph, its edges yellowed. With time. In it were Ricardo and I, about 50 years younger, smiling in front of this very house. I was wearing a floral dress, and he had his arm around my waist. Our eyes shone with the promise of a future, with the pride of someone who had just put down roots, who had turned a dream into walls and a roof. The memory of that day flooded me with an overwhelming force. I remembered Ricardo's laugh, his infectious optimism. "This house, Elena," he had told me, "is not made of bricks and mortar. It's made of our love, our partnership. It is our fortress." Looking at that photo, at that young, vibrant woman I once was like a jolt of reality. The woman in the photo would not hide, would not beg, would not allow a tyrant to starve her in her own home. That house was the symbol of everything we had built together. Ricardo worked 2 jobs for nearly 10 years so we could make the down payment. I worked double shifts at the hospital, and every penny we saved was another brick in our castle. We painted it together, planted every rose in that garden. Submitting to Marcos was not just a betrayal of myself. It was a betrayal of Ricardo's memory, of the legacy of love and respect he left behind. I remembered who I was. Elena, the head nurse. The woman who led teams in life-or-death situations, who comforted grieving families, who held instruments with a steady hand to save lives. My hands, now trembling with weakness, were once tools of strength and precision. I had an identity, a dignity forged through years of hard work and compassion. How could I have allowed myself to be reduced to this? Ricardo's death was the beginning of the crack. Loneliness was an unwelcome and persistent visitor. It was then that Marcos, newly divorced and in financial trouble, suggested moving in. "To take care of you, Mom," he said, "so you won't be alone." His words at the time sounded like a balm, a comfort in the midst of grief. Little did I know he wasn't building a bridge, but rather the walls of my future prison. The control started subtly. First, it was the finances. "Mom, you don't need to worry about bills. Let me handle it for you. Just give me power of attorney. It makes everything easier." Trusting my only son, I signed the papers. Then, he started screening my calls, turning away my friends who came to visit. "Mom's resting," he would say. "She's been very forgetful lately. She prefers the quiet." He isolated me from the world, brick by brick, lie by lie. The neighbors, who used to stop and chat with me in the garden, now just waved from a distance, believing the farce that I was a frail, confused old woman, and he, a devoted, protective son. He had stolen not only my money but my reputation, my social life, my voice. His cruel voice echoed in my mind, a constant recording of veiled insults. "You're weak. You don't know things anymore. You're a burden." For years that voice mixed with my own, and I began to believe it. The fear of his reaction, of his anger, paralyzed me. What if I tried something and failed? The retaliation would be terrible. Fear was a heavy chain, and he knew exactly how to keep it around my neck. But now, on the floor of the dark room, another voice began to speak louder. It was Ricardo's voice, echoing from the letters in my lap. I opened one, my fingers tracing the words I knew by heart. "My Elena, never doubt your strength. You have the heart of a lioness and a soul of steel." His voice, full of love and admiration, was the antidote to Marcos's poison. I was not weak. I was not useless. I was Elena, Ricardo's wife, the head nurse, the owner of that house. The humiliation I felt in the kitchen turned into fuel. The pain of hunger became the fire of indignation. The fear didn't disappear, but now it had a powerful competitor. My will to live, to take back what was mine by right. And then, another memory surfaced, a spark in the darkness, an old prepaid cell phone. I had bought it a few years ago, right after Ricardo died, and kept it for an emergency, before Marcos took complete control. Where did I put it? My mind, once cloudy, was now sharp, focused, the false bottom of a sock drawer, a place he would never think to look. Hope was an electric shock, an adrenaline rush that gave me a strength I didn't know I possessed. I stood up, my body still aching, but my posture different, no longer stooped by defeat, but erect with determination. I walked silently to the dresser, my heart hammering against my ribs, this time not with fear, but with an electrifying anticipation. My fingers found the false bottom. There it was, small, old, but charged. I held the device in my hands, and it felt as heavy as a weapon. It was my weapon. It was my link to the outside world, my only chance. The fear of Marcos's reaction was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but the image of his cruel smile as he denied me food was stronger. Who could I call? Friends and neighbors believed his, charade. The police might not take a family dispute seriously without concrete proof. I needed someone who would not only believe me, but who had the power to act. The name came to my mind with crystalline clarity. Sophia, my niece, my late sister's daughter, a brilliant and relentless lawyer living in Los Angeles. Marcos kept her at a distance, always with an excuse for her not to visit. He feared her. He knew Sophia was too smart, too perceptive. She wouldn't be fooled by his good son facade. She was my only hope, my cavalry. The bond of blood and her profession made her the perfect ally. Holding the phone, its screen illuminating my face in the darkness, I felt a complete transformation. The woman who had begged for food a few hours earlier was dead and buried. In her place was a survivor, a warrior. I was no longer fighting for a plate of food. I was fighting for my life, for my house, for my soul. I pressed the power button, my finger trembling slightly. I waited for dawn. The plan was forming in my mind, each step clear and precise. I knew the night would be long and the dawn dangerous. But for the first time in a long time, I was not waiting for the end. I was planning a new beginning. The connection to my past gave me the strength to fight for my future. The night dragged on, a silent torture. Every noise in the house was amplified in the darkness. The hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of the settling wood. I remained seated on the floor. Ricardo's letters and the photograph beside me, like sentinels of my past and guardians of my future. The hunger was still there, a dull, persistent ache, but now it was a reminder of the injustice, an ember that fueled my determination. I was not a victim awaiting rescue. I was a strategist planning the battle. I remembered an old sewing kit, stored in the same dresser as the cell phone, another remnant of my former life, filled with threads, needles, and small treasures useless in Marcos's eyes. With the same care as a thief in her own home, I opened the drawer and searched in the dark. My fingers found what they were looking for, an old wire, flexible but strong, that I used to unjam the sewing machine, a small, insignificant tool that would become the key to my freedom. I approached the door, my heart pounding against my ribs. Fear was a physical presence, a cold sweat on my brow. What if he woke up? What if he heard the noise? I inserted the tip of the wire into the lock, a gesture that felt profane and bold. My fingers, stiffened by age and tension, were clumsy. The sound of the metal scraping inside the mechanism seemed to echo through the entire house, as loud as a scream. For a moment, panic seized me. I stopped, holding my breath, listening. Silence. Only the sound of his heavy breathing coming from the master bedroom at the end of the hall. I gathered my courage and continued, this time more delicately, remembering the patience I had as a nurse. I moved the wire slowly, feeling the internal pins of the lock, and then an almost imperceptible sound. But to me, it was an explosion, a soft click. The lock had given way. I opened the door millimeter by millimeter, the soft creak of the hinges a symphony of freedom. The air in the hallway felt different, fresher, less laden with oppression. With the cell phone hidden in my robe pocket, I began to move. Every step was calculated, treading on the spots on the floor I knew didn't creak. I passed his bedroom door, a sleeping monster that could awaken at any moment and destroy everything. I found refuge in the guest bathroom, the only place I knew I would have absolute privacy. I locked the door from the inside and sat on the cold floor, the cell phone in my hand. The light from the screen was blinding. I found the name Sophia in the contact list. My finger hovered over the call button for a second that felt like a lifetime. This was the point of no return. I took a deep breath and pressed it. The phone rang once, twice. Then my niece's sleepy voice came through. Hello? In a choked voice, in an urgent whisper, I told her everything. Sophia? It's Aunt Elena. I'm sorry for the hour, but I need help. Marcos. He locked me in my room. He's not giving me food. I'm scared. There was no hesitation in her voice. The sleepiness was instantly replaced by a sharp seriousness. Auntie, where are you now? Are you safe? I'm in the bathroom, I whispered. I managed to get out. Stay there. Don't make any noise. Don't confront him. I'm leaving Los Angeles right now. I've called the police to meet me there. We'll be there by dawn. Just hold on. I'm going to get you out of there. Hanging up the phone was like releasing a weight I had been carrying for years. The validation, the immediate belief in Sophia's voice, was the first drop of rain in a desert of loneliness. I returned to my room, my heart calmer, and left the door just ajar. I was no longer a prisoner. I was bait, waiting for the right moment for the trap to spring. I sat in the chair by the window, watching the darkness outside begin to give way to a deep blue, and then a pale gray. The sunrise had never seemed so beautiful, so full of promise. Every shade of orange and pink that painted the sky was a stroke of hope, the announcement that the night of my suffering was finally coming to an end. The world was waking up, and so was I. Then, I heard it. The soft sound of a car stopping on the street, doors closing with a discreet solidity, and then knocking. Firm, unequivocal knocking on the front door. It wasn't the knock of a neighbor or a delivery person. It was the knock of authority. The sound echoed through the silent house, the harbinger of change. From his room, I heard Marcos grumble, the sound of his heavy feet on the floor, irritated at being woken up. "I'm coming!" he yelled, his voice full of the arrogance of someone who feels he is king of the castle. I stood up and went to the top of the stairs, my frail body now a pillar of silent strength. I wanted to see. I needed to see the moment his world would crumble. He opened the door, his face twisted in an impatient scowl, ready to dismiss whoever it was. But his face changed. The scowl dissolved, replaced by a pale shock. Standing on the porch was not a solitary figure, but three. Sophia, standing tall, a folder in her hand and a look of steel in her eyes. Beside her, two uniformed police officers, the image of law and order, the manipulative smile. Marcos tried to muster died before it was born. Sophia took a step forward, giving him no time to speak. "Marcos," she said, her voice clear and firm, cutting through the morning air. "I am Sophia Ramirez, Elena's attorney. You are being served with an emergency restraining order and an immediate eviction notice. You have 1 hour to collect your personal belongings and leave this property." She handed him the papers. The words restraining order and eviction hit him like punches. It was at that moment that I began to descend the stairs. Slowly, one step at a time, my hand sliding along the banister. I was no longer hiding. My steps were deliberate, audible. Marcos turned, the papers trembling in his hand, and his eyes met mine. Panic and betrayal danced across his face. "Mom!" he shouted, his voice high with disbelief and fury. "Mom! What have you done?" I stopped on the last step, facing him, feeling the eyes of the officers and Sophia on me. But my focus was only on him. The fear that had paralyzed me for years had evaporated, replaced by a cold, unshakable dignity. I looked into the eyes of the man who had caused me so much pain, and for the first time, I didn't see my son. I saw a stranger, an unwanted tenant in my home and in my life. With a firm, clear voice, louder than I had used in years, a voice he had never heard before, I answered, "I have taken back what is mine. This house was never yours. Now, get out." The door closed behind Marcos with a dull thud, and the silence that followed was unlike any I had ever known in that house. It was not the heavy silence of oppression, but the light, clean silence of liberation. The air seemed easier to breathe. I looked at Sophia, who gave me a tired but proud smile, and at the police officers, who regarded me with professional and compassionate respect. In that instant, standing in my living room, I was no longer a ghost. I was the mistress of the house, reclaiming my throne. Sophia's first order of business even before sitting down, was to call an emergency locksmith. Less than an hour later, a man was working on my front door. I watched, fascinated, as he dismantled the old lock, the same one my son had used to imprison me. Seeing that piece of metal, a symbol of my humiliation, being removed and replaced with a new, shiny, and secure one, was the first concrete act of my new life. I took the new key myself. Its solid, cold weight in my hand was the weight of security and control. While the locksmith worked, Sophia went to the kitchen. The smell of scrambled eggs and fresh coffee soon filled the house, simple, domestic aromas that had been foreign to me for so long. She served me a hot plate, and I ate. I ate slowly, savoring every bite as if it were the first meal of my life. And, in a way, it was. Each mouthful nourished not only my starving body but also my wounded soul, a balm of care and normalcy that healed more than any medicine. In the days that followed, the house underwent a process of purification. With Sophia's help on the weekends, we began to exorcise Marcos's presence from every room. We packed up his designer clothes, his electronics, his cold and impersonal furniture. Every sealed cardboard box was a piece of the past being shipped away forever. Watching him come to pick up his things, escorted by an officer to ensure he complied with the restraining order, unable to speak a word to me, was the final confirmation that the power had, indeed, changed hands. Top priority was my bedroom. The small room that had been my cell became my project of rebirth. I chose a vibrant yellow paint, the color of the morning sun. I painted the walls myself, each brushstroke an act of defiance, covering the gray memories with a new layer of hope. I replaced the dark curtains with light, white fabric ones that danced with the breeze. The room ceased to be a prison and became my private sanctuary. Slowly, the entire house began to reflect my identity again. My old, comfortable reading chair, which Marcos had relegated to the basement, returned to its place of honor in the living room. The walls, once bare or decorated with his soulless art, now displayed the photographs of my life. My wedding to Ricardo, the trips we took, the family parties. The house once again had my scent, my touch, my story. The garden, which had been neglected, became my therapy. I started spending my mornings outdoors, my hands in the dirt, pulling out the weeds that had grown, an obvious parallel to my own life. I planted new flowers, talked to Ricardo's roses, and felt life pulsing beneath my fingers. That piece of land was not just a yard. It was a mirror of my own ability to bloom again, even after a long and harsh winter. Reconnecting with the world was the hardest step, but the most necessary. The first call was to my old friend Clara. With a trembling voice, I told her the truth, expecting judgment or disbelief. What I received was a cry of solidarity from the other end of the line and the promise of a visit the next day. The shame I had felt was washed away by the wave of support I began to receive. My neighbors, upon learning the truth, came to apologize, one by one, with cakes, flowers, and words of support. They were not to blame. Marcos was a skilled manipulator, but reconnecting with them, the chats over the fence, the invitations for coffee, began to mend the social net that he had methodically cut. The loneliness he imposed was replaced by the warmth of community. It was during a conversation with Sophia that the idea came up. Auntie, your story. It can help other people who are going through what you went through, in silence. At first, the idea scared me. Expose my pain? But then I realized my pain was no longer an open wound. It was a scar. And scars tell stories of survival. I was no longer a prisoner of fear. I could be a champion of hope. My first talk was at a small community center, in front of an audience of 20 or 30 people, mostly seniors. My heart pounded. But when I began to speak, I didn't tell a victim's story. I told a story of rescue. I talked about the subtle signs of financial and psychological abuse, about isolation, about the importance of maintaining autonomy. I saw recognition in the eyes of some, and I knew I was doing the right thing. My life transformed completely. The silent house now echoed with the laughter of my friends from the gardening club. The phone rang with invitations, not commands. I managed my own finances, made my own decisions, lived on my own terms. From a prisoner in a luxury house, I became the queen of my castle, an advocate for a cause. I discovered that true ownership is not in a property deed, but in the possession of oneself. Dignity is priceless, ageless, and cannot be taken away unless we surrender it. And most importantly, it is never, ever too late to fight for it. The woman who begged for food was a version of me, but the woman who now taught others to recognize their own worth was who I truly am. My vision for the future is simple: to continue cultivating my garden, both of flowers and of friendships, and to continue using my voice to illuminate the shadows where elder abuse hides. I want my story to be a beacon, showing that the end of a cycle of pain can be the beginning of a new and inspiring chapter, a chapter written with courage, resilience, and above all, self-love.